Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is our examination of episode 2 of season 6 of Dark Side of the Ring. The episode features Tony Halame, aka Ludvig Borga. So, Dark Side of the Ring. It is one of the few documentary series that is dedicated to burying the subject. I mean, most Dark Side of the Ring episodes is about how many people hate you that we can get on camera at one time. I mean, try having somebody who speaks any positivity on this guy, and there is none. You know, even the one person who married him, who said that she loved him, called him a POS at one point. So let's get into this as per the usual. I did a little bit of extra reading, but I did cover pretty much everything when it comes to Tony Halame, Ludvig Borga's life. And a lot of it stems from two things. One, how he grew up being bullied and picked on, and his obsession with masculinity, his obsession with his image, with leading and becoming this character that he created for himself called the Viking. And basically wanted to be that, and then once that was gone, he saw no further reason to live. I can see that as a pretty good narrative that you want to run with. Another issue that you could have discussed is, you know, he had alcoholic parents. He became an alcoholic himself. You know, injuries from doing boxing and professional wrestling led to a painkiller addiction, which, you know, leads to some behavioral changes and behavioral issues in general. But he's the most famous Finnish person I know. So there's that. But I'm not going to go through his entire life story, but I just want to hit some of the high points. So Ludvig Borga, aka Tony Halame, he came to the United States in the 1980s. He joined the Universal Wrestling Federation, which was, you know, a whole thing run by Herb Abrams. What a disaster that was, where he played the character of the Viking. He also wrestled in New Japan. He won the IWGP Tag Team Championships with Scott Norton. This was in 1992. The two of them would get into a fight where it is disputed who won the fight. In the documentary, they said that Halame, Tony, Ludvig Borga, sucker punched Scott Norton and knocked him out. And then there is the sort of belief that Scott Norton got the upper hand on him, but Scott Norton himself does not appear in this episode, even though I'm pretty sure Scott Norton is still alive, and Scott Norton was featured in other Dark Side of the Ring episodes. So he so hated this man, he chose not to participate. He also, in around 1993, before coming to the WWF, he appeared on the Finnish version of the American Gladiators. I am a huge fan of the American Gladiators, and I think this is actually pretty damn cool that he was on that show. This is in 1993. He actually was on the first 2 seasons of the show. He specified in the breakthrough and the duel. I'm thinking the duel was like the joust, where they would hit each other with those giant Q-tips. And the breakthrough would be like the football, the American football kind of thing, where you had to score points, or was it the one you had to carry the ball? It was one or the other. But that's pretty damn cool. And his biographer, who was named Mikko, the last name was a nightmare. I didn't even bother to try to write it down. Said that, you know, he became famous in Finland because everybody loved that character. And the show was on the air for several years, but he was only on the first 2 episodes because he became Ludvig Borga in the WWF from 1993 to 1994. He was brought in specifically to work with Tatanka. Now, Tatanka is actually in the episode of Dark Side of the Ring, and they tell the story of Tatanka having this undefeated streak, and they're going to try to give you this belief that everybody loved Tatanka. I was there. Everybody was okay with Tatanka. I can tell you that there was a little shit given about Tatanka and Ludvig Borga pretty much at the same time. I know that became a big thing with like Cornette and Jim Ross and whoever that Finnish guy is who says he's the father of Finnish wrestling or some shit. But those three guys hate this fella. But I don't think anybody cared about Tatanka having an undefeated streak either. Nobody really gave a damn. It was never a big thing among me and my friend group, and we watched wrestling every week. None of us was ever like, oh man, Tatanka is so great. It was like, he was on the same tier as like Savio Vega. And that's partially why it didn't really work. Because, yeah, Tatanka had like a 2-year undefeated streak, and Borga beat him. But it's not like Tatanka was beating people who matter. Tatanka was beating mostly jabronis. If he wrestled anybody with a name, usually they were either a faded name, like Rick Martel, and they were doing jobs here and there, or there was jabronis, like straight up jabronis. So Tatanka never won any belts, never did anything major, never got put in any major. I think his most serious storyline was the heel turn with Lex Luger. So no, I know that Dark Side of the Ring wants people to think that this mattered. It did not. It did not, and that's why it didn't work. You know, Ludvig Borga could have been super boring, and he kind of was. But if he had beaten somebody who mattered, he probably would have got over. The rub probably would have worked. But Tatanka couldn't give anybody the rub. He didn't have nothing to rub. Which was the funny thing about the episode. They're like, Tatanka's like, oh, it's called giving the rub. I'm like, who are you giving the rub to? You were barely over your damn self. 2 years in the company and nobody really gave a damn. Good luck finding a match where somebody gave a shit about Tatanka. And I'm not saying that because I didn't like Tatanka. I'm just saying that I lived through this. I was 12, 13 when this stuff happened. And I could tell you, we were unmoved by Tatanka versus Ludvig Borga. And we were unmoved by Ludvig Borga. Despite the fact that he looks like some mishmash of Brock Lesnar and Machoke. I mean, it's just, nobody gave a shit. But they told the story, of course, of him being built up to wrestle Lex Luger. And JR was very, very unhappy with Ludvig Borga. Not just with his inability to talk, his inability to get over, but, of course, the Nazzi tattoo, which was on his calf, which, of course, nobody could see. The exit-only tattoo on his lower back, which you couldn't see because he was wearing gear all the time. That was actually quite funny. The exit-only tattoo was humorous because it's on his lower back, and it's insane. It's insane that you would get that tattooed on you. I mean, it's absolutely it's one of the funniest things about this episode. But back to the SS tattoo. Jim Ross basically says, hey, we didn't know that was there when we hired him, and he wasn't recruited by Jim Ross. I honestly don't remember who was recruiting talent at the time. Who was making the calls at the time. But I do know that Ludvig Borga had some connection to Rick Bassman. Because Rick Bassman was the guy who got Ludvig Borga the fight with Randy Couture at UFC 13 several years later. So perhaps Rick Bassman sent Vince McMahon Ludvig Borga, and that's where he came from. That's one of the things I really was interested in. Where did he come from? Like, who gave Vince a picture of this guy and said, hey, this guy could be, your next top star? I just wonder where that came from. But I'm gonna go on a limb and say Rick Bassman, the same guy who found Sting and the Ultimate Warrior and John Cena and Samoa Joe. He could also be responsible for Ludvig Borga. Before we get there, though, there's a story between Carl Ouellet and Jacques Rougeau that tells the story of these guys being blamed by the Steiner brothers for letting out the air in Ludvig Borga's tires. This is something they talked about on Hannibal TV because Jacques Rougeau, noted puncher of Dynamite Kid, he thought he was going to have to fight Ludvig Borga after Ludvig Borga's car had been damaged and the Steiner brothers blamed the Quebecers for it. They thought he was going to fight them. And specifically, Jacques thought he was going to have to fight Ludvig Borga. But it ended up being no big deal. And that was a weird thing because his reputation is that he was a total complete jerk and a bully and an asshole and all that stuff. And yet there was no examples of it. I thought that was weird. Usually when somebody says there's, examples of a guy being a bully, you would show some. This was a story you could have talked about because at least Jacques Rougeau was concerned about it. But I couldn't find any stories of him actually bullying anybody. Not that you should be able to bully grown men anyway, but, just saying. So Ludvig Borga ended up being a entire flop. It didn't work. I mean, yes, the part of the issue is nobody knows where Finland is. That was a time where you probably should have changed someone's nationality and just made them Russian or something like that, and it probably would have worked a lot better. German. I wouldn't have known the difference. If you'd have told me Ludvig Borga was German, I'd have been like, And maybe that was the idea, and then he insisted on being Finnish because he's Finnish, and he's a Finnish nationalist, which is weird, but I'm not surprised. There's nationalists for all countries. And we're going to talk about that. We're probably going to spend a little too much time on that. But Ludvig Borga ended up being a total wash. So he leaves the company in 1994. He actually goes to fight in rings in Japan. That was skipped over. He fought Akira Maeda in Japan in 1994. He only had like 3 or 4 matches. He didn't have a lot. And he was quite terrible, actually, from the looks of things. So he ends up fighting Randy Couture in 1997. This is after he has another stint in pro wrestling for the Catch Wrestling Association in 1995, where he wrestled as a main event talent. So he goes to Rick Bassman, and he ends up fighting Randy Couture at UFC 13 in 1997. So Rick Bassman, he writes on his website, Tony had a short yet successful run in the World Wrestling Federation as Ludvig Borga, having also held the dubious title of Finnish heavyweight boxing champion. Tony was at loose ends, looking for something to do. My notion of what a real fighter was in those days, my pre-educated period, whoever looked the most intimidating was in fact the toughest. And based on the criteria, Tony was absolutely the toughest man on the planet. Now, before we get into that, Rick Bassman mentions this Finnish heavyweight championship. Now, it's an interesting thing because his biographer says he never had a boxing fight in Finland, but there is footage of Tony Halame fighting people in Finland. There is a boxing record of 13-6 on the website. He knocked out 10 people, was knocked out 5 times. So I don't know if that was outside of Finland or what. He also mentions later that he was the Finnish heavyweight boxing champion. I don't know what any of this means. A 15-6 record is not great, by the way. That's not a good record. Getting knocked out 5 times is not good. It's not good. You're not good at boxing. All right, you're not good at fighting. Anyway, Rick Bassman continues by saying, I had a somewhat regular dialogue going with the UFC booker Art Davie and began to pitch Tony to him and pitch him and pitch him. I finally broke down Art Davie's defenses when, entirely without conviction, Art said, I'm either going to look like a visionary or a complete idiot. Let's try him. He says, Tony was booked for a 4-man tournament to be held May 30th, 1997. So Rick Bassman says that the internet rumors were that Tony had been kicked out of WWF for being too rough backstage. He was fighting entire gangs, that basically he had this inflated reputation from the internet at the time. This was 97, of course. Of course, there are stories of Tony and his friend Krister, who is actually in the documentary, probably one of the only people who spoke in somewhat positive tones about Tony Halame, getting into bar fights and that they were beating up guys in bars. So at least there's some element of truth to that. And this is what got Tony Halame to fight with Randy Couture. So Rick Bassman takes him to Gene LaBelle's academy, Hollywood Academy, to train for the mixed MMA fight They say he only trained for a little bit before actually going to fight Randy Couture. And they even said it in the documentary he did not take the fight seriously because he thought that it was going to be like boxing where he can just go in there and throw punches. And the first thing Randy Couture did was take his big ass down, which is the same thing that happens to everybody who is good with their hands and you get into a UFC fight. The first thing they do is take you to the ground. It's the first thing they do, man. So, Rick Bassman continues by saying, Tony Halame is a legitimately scary, strong guy, and he must have at least some boxing skill. I have little or no doubt that whatever it is he's done some damage along the way. He's also a very colorful and charismatic guy. He was a star in the old WWF and went on to become, among all things, an elected member of the parliament in his home country of Finland. What's up with this star stuff? He was not a star, brother. He was on the show. he participated, but that's about it. So they tell the story that he was deported. They didn't say what year he was deported in for having trafficking steroids and having an Uzi. And he met some Aryans in jail who recognized him. They also mentioned that he in Japan has some skinhead friends. Skinhead friends in Japan? That's interesting. He basically, once he gets deported, he's a household name in Finland. He sells a record. They showed the absolutely terrible song that he sings, which I don't know if a song can sound good in that language. Just a really weird language. They say he writes a biography, which is 2 parts biography, 1 part political manifesto, full of lies and offensive language. And this is where my eyebrows start to go up because I'm like, okay, offensive language. His business partner pitches the idea to him to get into politics. And the guy says that Tony wanted to be a Nazi. He wanted to have a Nazi party, but there was no Nazi party in Finland. So he joined the True Finns Party. Now, the True Finns Party is very interesting because I looked it up. I'm a nerd. This is what I do, brother. And it is a populist, radical, right-wing party that was started in 1995. The focus is on national identity, very anti-immigrant. They focus on crime and personal safety and, of course, jobs. Because of his celebrity, they said he was the 5th most voted person in Finland. He got 38% of the party vote. And one of his platforms was sending pedophiles, rapists, and drug dealers to Russian prisons to serve long sentences. He was a very popular with young voters. And they showed some outrageous things that he said on television about he'd never seen rapists with no arms, which sounds psychotic because it is. So the True Finns Party are what they call monoculturalist, which is they're very opposed to immigration. And at the time, and they set the stage in the documentary by telling you, hey, Finland had joined the EU, and pretty much once you join the EU, you're just not a country anymore. Essentially, you're a globalist slop. That means anybody can just come into your country and speak whatever language they want, bring whatever religion they want, and change the entire culture of your country. Now, they try to tell us in the Vice Dark Side of the Ring that, it was a different time in Finland, the 2003 when this happened. We're a very liberal country now. But he was so popular then because he was a celebrity. And it was like, it was a lot like Donald Trump. Now, you knew they were going to go there. I started reading some of this stuff before the episode. So I knew they were going to play the Donald Trump angle. I just knew it. It was obvious, right? It was obvious. So they want everybody to know, hey, we're a good globalist country now. We have no real national identity. We have a language, but you don't have to speak it. But whatever. I mean, again, the Donald Trump thing. So in any event, he resigns from Parliament after there's a shot fired in his home. This is from a domestic incident to where his wife was going to leave him, and he started pounding drugs and drinking. Then he ended up choking on his own vomit and suffered some brain damage. and basically changed as a person after this. He avoided prison by claiming that his drink had been spiked. In his body, they found amphetamines and steroids. He claimed his drink had been spiked. He also claimed that he had a gun because he was trying out for a movie role, because he was a famous actor. He was in some commercials, and he was in Die Hard with a Vengeance. So he had a real gun for an acting role, and apparently he was so popular people believe this. But he still was forced to resign from the party in 2007. At this point, he started having some real physical changes. His memory was not what it used to be. Physically, his body wasn't what it used to be. The toll of drugs and alcohol from years and years started to weigh on him. He lost a lot of weight, if you've seen him. And right before he died, he wasn't big and jacked anymore. And if the image that he had projected onto the world could not be who he was, then he chose not to live anymore. This is the story that Dark Side of the Ring tells us. So he commits suicide. His friend Krister finds him 2 days after his birthday. Well, I guess he finds him 4 days after his birthday, because everything that I saw say he died on the 8th of January, 2010. His birthday is on the 6th. So apparently he had been dead a while when Krister found him in the home. So probably one of the more brutal parts of the episode is they asked what his legacy was. And Jim Cornette and the Finnish wrestling guys, they basically just said he was a nondescript heel who couldn't get over and have any charisma, no personality. JR said he was an asshole. He didn't stand out at this time. His wife, who had called him a piece of shit earlier, said, well, there was a good side to him. That's why I was in love with him. That's why I married him. And I don't know why he had a Nazi tattoo. Oh, I don't know that he had Nazi memorabilia. I was just a girl. I didn't know nothing about none of that stuff. I'm not going to get into her. But very strange that she married this guy who had a Nazi tattoo, who had the exit only tattoo, who ended up going to Russia and coming back with Nazi memorabilia. And she didn't know anything about this. She didn't know anything about Nazis. He never once spoke about his interest in Nazis to me. Interesting. Anyway, but his biographer actually did what I think was the best summation of his career. Saying basically he learned about showmanship in the United States. He was already a charismatic showman, popular in his own country, and he revolutionized Finnish politics. He was the blueprint for a lot of the nativist, Donald Trumpist kinds of individuals that populate the European Union today. And he was that way in 2003. And you think about a lot of these people who are just now getting on board with their country being overrun with foreigners, and this guy was ahead of the curve. He was there in 2003. Most of these people are just now catching on in like 2016, So I get it. It was a really good episode featuring a really interesting subject. My only issue is I don't like that this episode was dedicated to burying him, and not trying to. I'm not saying you need to both sides it, because you don't really need to. I mean, the guy did have a Nazi tattoo, and he's pretty clear about how he feels. But when you're talking about a subject that is sort of controversial, just saying, yeah, everybody hates him, doesn't feel accurate to me. It doesn't feel right, because the guy got married twice. And he was very popular with the public. There has to be a reason for that. And instead of going into, he's a racist, he's a xenophobe, he hated gays and lesbians, and it's like, okay, he did nothing that people liked. Like him being a guy who was a straight shooter, which some people like. Some people like that, even if they don't like what's being said, they appreciate the balls that it takes to say it. And It seems to me that when you don't confront an issue, you open the door for people who don't give a fuck to confront the issue. So 38% of the vote going to a guy that you think is a racist and a homophobe, maybe there's some issues in your country that should have been addressed. That way, 38% of the people would not have voted for this guy. And it's the same lesson that the Democrats in the United States need to learn. You want to keep losing, keep ignoring the issues that Donald Trump keeps talking about. Or you can actually fix some of these issues, and then guys like Donald Trump wouldn't be able to rise up and take you from behind. And besides, not to excuse being a Nazi, which there is no excuse, but when you take into account some of the complaints that a person who would have those sort of sympathies would present, the fact that the culture of their country is changing, the fact that you may have rise in crime, which was of course a big issue for any country that is going to have immigration issues, is typically the immigrants it takes time for the immigrants to acclimate to the country. Maybe there was some bending of the knee, maybe not to the extreme degree that you see in places like France and Italy and England today, but maybe there was some of that where, they were trying to whitewash the crime rate, and immigrants are coming in and causing rise in crime. If you take care of these things, if you say, look, we got a welfare system, but we're not going to allow the immigrants to overburden the welfare system, you can actually break up a lot of this hated rhetoric that you hear, and it's easier to get rid of these guys. It's a lot easier if a guy is being offensive and calling people the N-word, calling the president a lesbian, which he said was an accident, by the way. He said he thought she legitimately was a lesbian. And all the offensive things that he said and did, if he was not the voice of the voiceless, then he would not have been voted into office. The best way to handle that stuff is to dissipate the beliefs across the larger swath. If everybody takes a common sense position that your country is supposed to be for the people who live in it and not, some globalist gray slop who just happens to have an individualized flag for now, but you have a culture that comes from a certain set of values, a certain set of people, and the folks who live there want to continue that for the future. If you respect that and honor it, then it's easier for you to say, look, we all honor the flag and honor these values and honor this culture and this country, but we don't need to go that far. And then we can kick these guys out. But when you want to bend over for the world and say, well, we have no values, we don't really have a country, you can come here and do whatever you want, we'll give you free stuff, then guess what happens? There's going to be a lot of people who are going to stand up and say, nope, not me, I don't want that. And then other people are going to be thinking it, but they're never going to say it. And those people are going to feel disenfranchised, who are going to say, why does most of the country hate itself? This is what Europe is going through right now. It is incredible how many people in Europe, from the Irish to the Scottish to the French to the Spanish to the Italians, they hate themselves. They're allowing some of their beautiful buildings and all of their history to be whitewashed and destroyed constantly, over and over again. You don't have to be that way. If you're going to slit your wrist and sit in the bathtub, figuratively, of course, then you could do it on your own. Everybody's not going to be down for that. And you have to realize that they are the extremists because you are the extremist. You are on the extreme of letting the globe run your country, letting people outside of your country run your country. That is a problem. And if you're going to be that extreme, then be prepared for opposition to be that extreme. But I knew they were going to do the Donald Trump thing, and I'm not that surprised. So I loved the documentary. I thought it was fun. You know, it's a very interesting guy. I hate how one-sided it was. I thought it could have used some levity on the other side. I mean, they did bring some of the humor in with the exit only tattoo, but they tried really, really hard to drill into your brain that this guy is a Nazi and a bully. But take into account that this guy was a mediocre fighter, extremely mediocre pro wrestler. I mean, he never really rose above basic competence in anything. He just had a fantastic look. And that was enough. He had a fantastic look and a big mouth. And that's pretty much what it boiled down to in terms of entertainment. Because he was not that impressive in anything that I've ever seen him in. And I did see him, a little bit of him in New Japan. I saw a little bit of him in rings. I saw a little bit of his boxing. None of that stuff was all that damn impressive, if we're being honest. But he's worthy of talking about because he went from being a poor kid with 2 alcoholic parents to making it into Parliament. You know, he made it to television. He became a star in the United States. He was on television. He did movies and TV shows and all this stuff. And it's the life that young people would want to live. It's just unfortunate that he wrapped up all of this stuff in an image that he wanted to portray to the world. And once that image started to fade and his fame started to fade, he's found no further reason to live. I think that is a bigger and more interesting story than his politics, if we're being honest. You know, it should tell the story to young people. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't just be how you look. You know, develop other things. You know, he didn't really develop a personality. You know, he did not really develop relationships. He did not really value those things. And in the end, those are the things that could have saved his life. If he kept people around him who cared about him and maybe have been able to help him with his drugs and alcohol addiction. But unfortunately, he had such a piss poor personality that he couldn't. You know, these are the kinds of things that you could have taught through this. But what I got out of this is Nazi tattoo, Nazi memorabilia, xenophobe, homophobe, the end. So that's all there is to it. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.
MagMongoSlade. Best house I ever drew, daddy.